What happens when a single destroyer, a vessel designed for escort and screening, finds itself staring down the largest battleship ever constructed? Can one ship, manned by a crew of just over 300 men, change the course of the greatest naval battle in human history? On October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar in the Philippine Sea, the world received its answer. This is the story of the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer, and its defiant charge against the overwhelming might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force. The date was the height of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The location, a patch of ocean just east of the Philippine island of Samar. The units involved were Task Unit April 3, 77, better known by its radio call sign, Taffy 3. They were a small group of jeep carriers, and their small boys, destroyers and destroyer escorts, meant only to support ground troops and hunt submarines. They were never meant to fight a surface fleet. But on this morning, they were all that stood between the Japanese juggernaut and the vulnerable invasion beaches of Leyte. By late 1944, the Empire of Japan was fighting a losing war. The Shogo, or Victory, plan was a desperate gamble to lure the American Third Fleet away from the Leyte Gulf landing beaches, allowing a massive surface force to slip through the San Bernardino Strait and annihilate the American invasion force. The plan worked with terrifying efficiency. Admiral William Bull Halsey, convinced that the Japanese center force had been neutralized by earlier airstrikes, took his powerful battleships and fleet carriers north to pursue a decoy force. This left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Enter Taffy 3. This task unit was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague. It consisted of 6 slow, thin-skinned escort carriers, 3 destroyers, the USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Herman, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. These ships were the lightweights of the Navy. The Fletcher-class Johnston, hull number DD-557, was the heart of this screen. The Johnston's commander was a man built for this moment, Commander Ernest E. Evans. A graduate of the Naval Academy and a man of Cherokee and Creek heritage, Evans was a warrior in the truest sense. Upon the Johnston's commissioning, he had told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and any man who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Little did the crew know how prophetic those words would be. The strategic situation was dire. While Halsey was hundreds of miles to the north, Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet remaining in the Imperial Japanese Navy, had successfully navigated the strait under the cover of darkness. As the sun rose over the Philippine Sea, the men of Taffy 3 looked at their radar screens and saw the impossible. Emerging from the morning mist were the pagoda masts of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Among them was the Yamato, the 72,000-ton behemoth carrying 18-inch guns that could hurl shells the size of a Volkswagen over 20 miles. Taffy 3 was outgunned by a ratio that defied military logic. At 6:44 hours, the lookouts on the Johnston spotted anti-aircraft fire to the northwest. Minutes later, the horrifying reality set in. The Japanese fleet was just 20 miles away and closing fast at 25 knots. Admiral Sprague, realizing the existential threat to his carriers, ordered all ships to lay smoke and retreat toward the south. But Commander Evans knew that a retreat alone would not save them. The escort carriers, with a top speed of only 18 knots, could never outrun the Japanese battleships and cruisers. Without waiting for orders from his superior, Evans gave the command that would become legendary. "All engines ahead, flank. Prepare for torpedo attack." The Johnston pivoted. While the rest of Taffy 3 fled, the lone destroyer accelerated to its maximum speed of 36 knots, charging directly toward the Japanese line. The crew watched in a mixture of awe and terror as the gap closed. 15,000 yards. 12,000 yards. 10,000 yards. The Japanese battleships, the Yamato, the Nagato, the Kongo, and the Haruna, began to open fire. The sea around the Johnston erupted in geysers of dyed water. The Japanese used colored dyes in their shells to calibrate their aim. Green, yellow, and red splashes surrounded the small destroyer. The Johnston was zigzagging violently, a maneuver known as chasing the splashes, where the pilot steers toward the last shell hit, betting that the enemy will adjust their aim elsewhere. The sound of the 18-inch and 14-inch shells passing overhead was like a freight train screaming through the air. Fear gripped the men in the engine rooms and the magazines, but the training took over. By 7:10 hours, the Johnston had closed to within 9,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Kumano, the flagship of the Japanese cruiser division. Evans ordered the 5-inch guns to open fire. Over 200 rounds were unleashed in rapid succession, turning the Kumano's superstructure into a chaotic mess of fire and twisted metal. But the Johnston's real teeth were its 10 Mark 15 torpedoes. At a range of 8,000 yards, Evans gave the order to fire. All 10 torpedoes hissed into the water. The destroyer then executed a sharp turn, retreating behind its own smoke screen. Minutes later, the results were confirmed. At least one torpedo had slammed into the Kumano, blowing off its bow and taking it out of the fight. The cruiser Suzuya, coming to assist, was also slowed by air attacks. The Johnston had effectively crippled 2 cruisers, but the giant was now angry. The Japanese battleships focused their fire. At 7:30, the Johnston's luck ran out. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo slammed into the ship, followed seconds later by 3 6-inch shells. The impact was catastrophic. The hits tore through the deck, detonating in the engine room and the aft boiler room. The Johnston's speed dropped from 36 knots to 17. The power to the aft 5-inch guns was severed. The situation was now desperate. The Johnston was a mangled wreck. The bridge had been shredded by shrapnel. Commander Evans had his fingers blown off his left hand and his shirt stripped from his back by the blast, yet he refused to leave his post. He wrapped his hand in a handkerchief and continued to give orders. With the bridge's steering control gone, Evans moved to the aft steering station, shouting commands down through an open hatch to the men below who were manually turning the rudder with a wrench. Blood slicked the decks. The bitter smell of cordite and burning oil filled the air. The Johnston was now a sitting duck in the water, shrouded by a tropical rain squall that provided a brief, miraculous moment of concealment. The crew used this time to effect repairs. They managed to restore power to 2 of the forward guns, but the ship was still limping. Outside the squall, the rest of Taffy 3 was being hunted. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was under heavy fire and would soon become the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the war. The other destroyers, the Hull and the Herman, along with the small Fry destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, had followed Evans' lead and launched their own suicidal charges. They were being torn apart. The Hull would soon sink under the weight of 40 hits. The Samuel B. Roberts, a ship never designed for surface combat, was fighting like a battleship, earning the nickname, the destroyer escort that fought like a dreadnought. By 8:30, the Johnston emerged from the squall to find the carrier Gambier Bay being pummeled by a Japanese cruiser. Despite his ship's crippled state, Evans didn't hesitate. "Interpose!" he ordered. The Johnston moved between the carrier and the cruiser, drawing fire away from the vulnerable jeep carrier. But the odds were simply too great. At 9 o'clock, a column of Japanese destroyers was seen closing in to deliver a final torpedo blow to the American carriers. The Johnston, with only one working engine and nearly out of ammunition, charged them. Evans ordered his gunners to fire at the leading Japanese destroyer, forcing them to launch their torpedoes early and wildly, missing the carriers entirely. The Johnston was now the center of attention for the entire Japanese fleet. 5 Japanese ships closed in, circling the lone destroyer like wolves around a wounded stag. They began plinking her, hitting her repeatedly with 5-inch and 6-inch shells. The 5-inch ammunition was nearly gone. The crew began using star shells and practice rounds, anything that could be shoved into the breeches. One by one, the Johnston's guns went silent. The ship was a flaming, blackened hulk. At 9:10 hours, the order was finally given to abandon ship. The Johnston was dead in the water, listing heavily to port. But as the men scrambled into the blood-stained water, something miraculous happened. Admiral Kurita, The Japanese commander aboard the Yamato was in a state of total confusion. For nearly 3 hours he had been harassed by what he believed were heavy cruisers and fleet destroyers. The sheer ferocity of the Johnston's charge, combined with the relentless air attacks from the taffy carriers, whose pilots were strafing the Japanese ships with nothing but dummy bombs and machine guns after running out of ordnance, convinced Kurita that he was facing the full might of Halsey's Third Fleet. The Yamato itself had been forced out of the main action early in the battle. During the Johnston's initial torpedo run, the Yamato had turned away to avoid the spread. Because of the Yamato's massive size and slow turning circle, the battleship ended up traveling several miles away from the battle, hemmed in by American torpedoes on both sides. Kurita, separated from the tactical picture and receiving reports of more American task forces nearby, lost his nerve. At 9:11, just as the Johnston was beginning its final plunge, Kurita issued the order. General withdrawal. He signaled his fleet to cease the attack and regroup to the north. The most powerful surface fleet in the world turned and fled from a handful of small, broken ships. The Johnston lingered for nearly another hour. As she went down, a Japanese destroyer, the Yukikes, cruised slowly past the survivors in the water. A Japanese officer on the bridge was seen standing at attention, saluting the sinking ship and its brave crew. They recognized that they had just witnessed a feat of arms that defied the laws of naval warfare. Commander Ernest Evans was never seen again. He was last spotted near the aft steering station, still directing his men. Of the 327 men aboard the USS Johnston, only 141 survived. Many of those lost died not in the battle, but in the harrowing days that followed, drifting in shark-infested waters as they waited for a rescue that was agonizingly slow to arrive. The battle off Samar was a victory that should have been an impossibility. Through the sacrifice of the USS Johnston, the USS Hull, and the Samuel B. Roberts, the Japanese center force was prevented from reaching the Leyte beachhead. Had Kurita broken through, the thousands of American troops on the shore and the supply ships in the bay would have been slaughtered, potentially delaying the liberation of the Philippines by months or years. The casualties were heavy. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Over 1,100 Americans were killed or wounded. But they had inflicted a strategic defeat on the Imperial Japanese Navy from which it would never recover. The Yamato, the pride of the Japanese fleet, had been forced to flee by a ship 1/30th its size. Commander Ernest E. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The Johnston received the Presidential Unit Citation. The ship's legacy was cemented in naval history as the ultimate example of the fighting spirit. In 2021, the wreck of the USS Johnston was discovered at a depth of 21,180 feet in the Philippine Trench, making it at the time the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed. The images returned by the submersible showed the ship's hull number, 557, still visible on the bow. Even in the crushing darkness of the abyss, the Johnston remains a sentinel, a silent witness to the morning when one destroyer dared to charge the sun. The battle off Samar proved that no amount of armor or firepower can compensate for a lack of resolve, and that a single vessel, commanded by a man of indomitable will, can indeed turn back the tide of history. The story of the USS Johnston is a testament to the courage of those who fought in the Pacific theater, where the vastness of the ocean was matched only by the scale of the sacrifice. While the great battleships like the Yamato are often the focus of history, it was the small boys and their crews who often carried the heaviest burden. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.